friction. But now we're going to hand over to one of our absolute, I don't know what to call Fiona, a friend. This conference is partly successful because of Fiona's contribution over the years. We always ask her to achieve the impossible, and here she are. She's just achieved the impossible again. She put together an absolute world-class panel of experts, and Sandy McGregor. Just to average it down to South African standards. Fiona, I have taken up the time to make sure all the online people have joined online. It is 4 o'clock. You've got a good 45 minutes. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions in the last 15 minutes. So over to you and your panel, and thank you again.
Yes. Bernard, who would have thought 10 years? I mean, people say to me, Paula hasn't aged a bit. No. They also say, Bernard hasn't yet grown up, hasn't aged a bit.
I liked her before, but now I'm not sure.
Anyway, can we, on a more serious note, this is a global industry, as we know, and this is going to be a global discussion, so it's really wonderful to have a global team on the panel. Welcome Rick from North America, and Henry from London, and Sandy
from Cape Town.
Join me, yes, join us. The theme in the program said, will this be business as usual for the next 10 years or dramatically different? And the seismic changes that are coming from the move to the energy transition almost answer that question. What I'm going to do is look at what it means for the environment for the industry, secondly, for investors in the mining industry, and finally, we'll go for what it means running a mining company for the next 10 years. So first of all, Henry. Henry's recently published a book which I can recommend unreservedly to everybody. It's called Volt Rush, Winners and Losers in the Race to Go Green. So I'm going to ask Henry just to kick off the panel and summarize his conclusions in what are the next 10 years going to be like. Henry.
Yeah, thanks so much, Fiona. So basically my book is looking at if we want to really accelerate development of electric vehicles to meet climate change commitments, this decade is really going to be quite key. And to do that, we're going to need lots of raw materials, as I'm sure you all know. And my book is really saying, let's open our eyes to these supply chains. Let's make sure these can be the lowest carbon supply chains, the best supply chains. If we have an opportunity to build this green infrastructure, in many cases from scratch, let's open our eyes and try to make it the best supply chains. Because the scale really needed to make a difference in terms of CO2, in terms of electrifying the global fleets, it is vast. And already in China, you're getting to a state where you're getting close to 25% of new vehicle sales are electric vehicles, and we're only at the beginning of this transformation. And so I also talk a bit about the geopolitics of these supply chains, because China really has quite a head start in essentially dominating a lot of sections of the battery supply chain in terms of processing, producing battery materials and producing batteries. But actually at the mining level, I mean, what's quite interesting is that, China doesn't produce many of these minerals itself. So China's had to go out overseas to buy minerals, and it's not completely dominant at that level. So it's quite interesting at the mining level that the West also has quite a few deposits. So my book is, just to sum up, my book is saying that we're in this transition. This energy transition is being driven by policy, by governments. It's going to be very rapid. And this decade, where we have this exponential demand increase, the pressure to increase raw material supply is going to be extreme. And we need to localize a lot of these supply chains. We need to clean them up. So we need to get to work. And I'm just saying, let's open our eyes. This is what it involves. It's not just an EV turns up at your door. We need these whole supply chains behind it.
Yes, I think you summed it up by saying we can't go green for free. There's a whole process out there. which millennials sometimes don't recognize. So there are chapters in Henry's book on the cobalt, the dirty processing, all of that. So the key conclusion I came to, Henry, and I was amazed on the chapters on the actual battery production, is that China has forged ahead because of strategy, policy, but also economic support for its industries. It now totally and utterly dominates the low-cost battery markets. Sandy, I'm going to move on to you. What do you think the energy transition will mean for global competition for critical metals assets and the geopolitical fallout potentially?
Yes, well, I think the last 2 years has been an amazing wake-up time for everyone in business around the world to realize how vulnerable our supply chains are, which has made a huge desire to actually localize. And companies, as a result of this, companies without governments telling them are seriously looking at the way they're doing things. And it's not a matter of economic policy of anyone, it's just companies are reacting to risks they didn't see. And the mere fact that all of a sudden Europe was, Germany had got 40% of its energy from gas from Russia, and that suddenly cut off is an amazing wake-up call for everyone of the dangers of being dependent on one particular country for a large amount of materials. Which brings one to China's role in, especially the battery metals, but generally in mining processing. China has the advantage of being able to build up these large processing works because it actually is confident it has markets which deliver them. One must remember, beneficiation tends to be located more and more close to markets which are the final consumers. And global transport has the cost of, whereas it used to be processing was next to a mine, now more and more it's done close to the final destination, which is what China's been doing. But it's been so successful that a lot of governments are now terrified, and that's what you see in the rather oddly named, Prevention of Inflation Act, or whatever it's called, in America, where a large part of it is about subsidies for electric cars, which will be denied to, with specific provisions that, yes, you'll get the subsidy as long as you don't get the raw materials from China. This is sort of, so you can see that governments are moving, as well as private companies, to relook at where they do business in their supply chains. Now, in the mining industry, I think the biggest problem coming forward is there has been actually, apart from in China, a major underinvestment in refining and processing. And we see it here in South Africa, where probably the limit to platinum group metals production is the refining capacity. You can dig the stuff. There's lots of easy to dig the stuff out, but you can't get it processed. But you see this most dramatically, of course, in the oil industry, where no one's building oil refineries except maybe one or two in India and China. And the world continues to need oil, and the crack spreads have just exploded because the limitation comes at that point in the chain. And that's an entirely new thing for the mining industry. Before, there was total availability of processing. So people just, the mines just expanded and they haven't really had problems getting it processed. But the underinvestment and the unprofitability of refining promotes that underinvestment, means, and the processing and that side of the industry, means that it's going to be quite a different, the industry is going to need quite a lot of investment in areas which actually is not just the mine, it's elsewhere. And I think that can change the whole economics and the structure of the mining industry.
Yeah, and the geopolitics. I think on previous panels I've suggested that non-Chinese governments must look for a big hub where they could encourage resource countries to process and then ship to US where permitting is so strict. And potentially that's something we can touch on for South Africa. But moving on to Rick. Rick, I love your posts on LinkedIn on stirring on governments, what governments should and shouldn't do. I remember one where you said Justin Trudeau was under pressure because he'd gone on some expensive holiday to the Caribbean, and you said, Justin, stay there as long as you like, because the longer you stay there, the less damage you can do at home. So I'm going to ask you two aspects on what we've touched on already. The first is, how do you suggest that non-Chinese governments can help facilitate the competition for the resources that they will need to drive their own energy transitions?
As you might suspect, I would ask governments mostly to get out of the way. If governments could see to providing the rule of law, see to a fairly clear permitting regime, allow private capital the opportunity to earn a reasonable return on capital investment with fiscal stability in place so that investors knew what the circumstance that they faced ahead of time, that would be more than sufficient. I don't need encouragement. I need an absence of active discouragement. The idea that government somehow is going to be involved in deeply capital-intensive activities for some time far in the future asks too much of government. Government exists to control power today, and the expenditures that a government makes that buys them votes today are consumption-related expenditures, not production-related expenditures. The shortages that South Africa is experiencing in Eskom, or the shortages that South Africa periodically experiences in water, the infrastructure investment shortfall, is all a function of the politicians seeing their best interest being in subsidizing consumer expenditures among their constituents today, which leaves zero capital, public or private, for longer-term capital-intensive expenditures, which will benefit humankind in a decade or a decade and a half. So my message to government would be, please, get out of the way and don't obstruct rational processes.
Yeah. Thank you. One area, could you comment on that? Recently we had the ex-Rio chairman in. He said a lot of the mining companies are now going to have to go back into the tougher jurisdictions. Yesterday, I think it was Chris Griffiths said the best grades are always in the worst places, and the battery metals are certainly going to be found in some difficult places. Is there a role for government in providing political risk insurance, do you think?
I think governments do provide political risk insurance, and I suspect that to the extent that, and by the way, I agree with him completely in terms of the fact that the best grades are in places that have been improperly explored for the last 100 years. I think probably most of the easy deposits to discover in the United States and Canada have been discovered. Is there a role for political risk insurance? Yes, probably. There probably is. I think it's unfortunate. I think it would be better if the industry did a better job bilaterally of making itself feel needed in developed markets. But until that occurs, I think there probably is a role, unfortunately, for organizations like the IFC and the World Bank to provide both political cover and functional political risk insurance.
Yeah. Just before I leave, Rick, we talk a lot about the consensus critical metals, but in the last year we've seen with the Russian war, the energy transition is now also competing for coverage, for people's attention with energy security, since prices, all of that, the war. do you think, you know a lot about uranium. Is uranium coming back as a critical metal for the next 10 years?
I think absolutely. I think when we talk about energy, we need to start with the premise that there are 7 billion plus of us, and there are more of us every day, that as a species, we've done a great job around the world of lifting the poorest of the poor out of abject poverty into merely dire poverty. But still, over 1 billion people on Earth have no access to electricity. So this isn't all about effete consumers and electric cars. This is about 1 billion people that would like to live like you and I live. The upshot of that is, with regards to energy, wind, of course, solar, certainly, uranium, absolutely, oil and gas, that too. It's important that we understand that this energy transition is going to take time, and if we don't manage it, that we will halt the advance of the poorest of the poor, and there will be dire consequences around that, and it's immoral too. So, I mean, I absolutely positively believe that in terms of energy density and the ability to create non-carbon generating baseload power, that uranium will be an absolutely critical part of our investment future. I would urge the South Africans in the audience to urge their government to pay some attention to South Africa's massive potential natural gas reserves, and also pay attention to South Africa's potential uranium reserves. There is all kinds of scope for South Africa to sit out some of the worst part of the dislocations that will occur in the energy transition over the next 25 or 30 years, including South African coal.
Yeah. Thank you. So moving on from the broad environment for the next 10 years for the industry, let's look at, will it be business as usual or very different for mining investors? And I have never seen in my career such opacity, such lack of clarity in the forecast for demand, supply, prices, and costs for the battery metals. So that's taking investors into the sphere of what Evie Hambro called conviction investing, and what a lot of other people call taking a big punt. So my question to the two experienced investors here, and we'll start with Sandy. How much slack will investors cut the companies investing in critical metals on making cash profits, or before they make cash profits from these businesses? And then in companies and investors, how do you value these things when you have no clarity on all those 4 items that I've just suggested?
Yeah, as you say, the future is remarkably unclear. This energy transition is going to be like building a house. It's going to take twice as long and cost twice as much. And
and leak.
Yes. And so we actually really we don't know, for instance, which battery technologies are going to win. All people have lots of ideas, but you don't know who the winners are. And there's enormous investment into new research onto batteries. So things could be very different in the outcome into what we expect. So it depends on it comes back to what the idea of whether you just take a big punt or not. There are a lot of investment managers whose mandates from their clients is not to lose their money, and that's the most important one. And if you're managing large pension assets, you have to be cautious about the risks you take, because your clients can't afford to take losses. So there's another class of investor, sort of you find quite a few of them in Canada and Australia, and in parts of the United States, the sort of gung-ho people who just go in and say it's a brilliant idea and they pour money at ideas. funny enough, those people don't need to do enormous amounts of analysis into deciding what they're going to do. They take an idea and they put money in and they run with it. That's what, by the way, the Chinese invest in that way, because they're not very big on feasibility studies. They just build it anyway. And we see the Belt and Road is a good example of what the outcome can be of that. Now, so that class of investor will still be there, and they will be probably the natural source of capital for the transition. The large pension funds and more cautious money will be only really want to come in until when something's established and clear that it's going to work. Yep. And the pool of money of the sort of courageous money is probably much less than many people think. It's quite a lot. There'll be trillions, but it's not nearly enough to do the transition, especially it's going to cost so much.
Rick, from your perspective, I don't think you manage pension funds anymore, so equity capital, PE, sovereign wealth funds, private funds, where do you see the money coming from for these punts, so to speak?
Well, I would agree very broadly with Sandeep. I think that the punter's willingness to take the punt will be increasingly dependent on whether they see the managerial class's interests aligned with their own. There was a lot of investor aggression in the early part of the decade 2000 to 2010. And the consequence of managements being allowed to grow mining companies without adult supervision had a very unhappy ending in the West. Stupid M&A, projects getting built that shouldn't have been built. And I suspect, at least for the next 5 or 10 years, that even the aggressive money will be aggressive, but with strings attached. All of us who finance exploration understand that we aren't investing in a business where we're going to see cash returns for 7 years or 8 years or 10 years. We're also by now mature enough, I think, that we pay attention to things like general and administrative expense as a percentage of exploration or project expense. And the circumstances that we saw 15 years ago, where North American juniors were spending 60% of capital raised on general and administrative expense, where a president was paying himself or herself $1 million a year as CEO, and then $350,000 a year as a contract geologist in a company that was spending $3 or $4 million a year. I think and I hope that those days are past. I believe that there is more than adequate capital available in the search for battery metals and other materials. But the capital is concerned about, I would suspect, 3 things. One is, if we make a discovery, will we be allowed to keep some of the economic benefit from it? Or is this expected by the host governments to be sort of a Red Cross effort? Many materials investors are concerned about the specter of global recession or perhaps even global depression, which doesn't eliminate the supply cliff, but it defers the supply cliff. And if you defer the supply cliff in a period of rising real interest rates, an increased cost of capital, the payoff becomes less secure. The idea, as an example, that because of batteries, the lithium price has to continue to go up, or in South Africa's case, the vanadium price will go up. All of those things are interesting, but they aren't relevant if the proper legislation doesn't exist, where the people responsible for the discovery and the development of the project don't get some of the benefit, where the benefit is delayed to such an extent that the cost of capital eats up the net present value of the deposit, All of those things, I think, have to be addressed. I believe they will be addressed, too, by the way. I think we have a rocky point, a rocky space to get through. I've been, myself, a consistent investor, or one might say punter, in the DRC since 1995. And I have to say, it's been a wild, wild, wild ride. It's been very pleasant, but the circumstance has, in fits and starts, gotten better for 30 years as Congolese society has gotten to know the mining industry and vice versa. I'm not trying to say that there isn't a long way to go, but I don't want to, if my remarks sound too harsh, suggest that I'm a pessimist for a minute. If I was a pessimist, I wouldn't continue in retirement to pour millions of dollars of my own private funds into exploration.
Well, we do hope that the Western investors who are tougher and held to tougher account on things like cost of capital and return on capital aren't undermined by new sources of capital. And one particular interest is Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, which is taking its super profits from these oil spikes and establishing funds that are now looking for the battery metals and critical metals around the world. So let's hope the West can wake up. So Henry, back to Henry. Henry works for a company called Benchmark Intelligence, and they are aiming to try and get clearer, firmer, more trustworthy forecasts on pricing and costs for these battery metals. Henry, can you tell us a little bit about what you're trying to do to help investors have some visibility on pricing?
Yeah, so we price all the battery minerals, and our prices are independently audited to IOSCO standards. So these are prices that we're seeing more and more in lithium, for example, that automakers will use us and let's say 3 pricing providers in a contract for supply of lithium, and more of the lithium, for example, is moving more to market-based pricing. It used to be quite a lot of sort of longer term contracts, and it's sort of moving more to market-based pricing. So, you're right. The prices have been incredibly volatile in this sector. I mean, lithium prices are up 400% over the past year in China. They're still rising in China. So, really providing more transparency for this sector is key. And what we're seeing is a much closer collaboration between automakers and miners. We've seen Rio Tinto and Ford signed deal, obviously BHP and Tesla before that. But that much closer collaboration, I think, will provide more certainty for mining companies and perhaps other juniors out there. We saw Ford recently help finance an Australian lithium company. This is the kind of thing I think we need to see to provide certainty to a lot of these mining companies. Yeah. I mean, just to your point about the West catching up, I mean, the West doesn't lack for capital, right? And we have all this ESG capital around, but it just hasn't come into this sector in a big way. So, I think we need that kind of money to come into this sector. But the speed at which the West is catching up now is remarkable. We have this Inflation Reduction Act in the US. I mean, just this week alone, there's been 2 announcements about battery factories in Michigan in the US. So, the amount of capital that now is flowing to this sector in the West is extraordinary and only going to get stronger.
Yeah. So that leads me on to the final umbrella area, which is, will running mining companies be very different coming over the next 10 years? So first question is, will the vast diversified groups that dominate the global mining industry, which some commentators compare to tankers, very hard to shift direction, will they be able to pivot to working more closely with, Henry said, the downstream players, the automotive, the battery manufacturers? They might have to work with junior miners, smaller deposits, increased government scrutiny, and as we said, more risky jurisdictions. So, Sandy, your view, can can the dinosaurs dance?
The reason why these companies became big is because each one of them had a major mine or a group of mines where they could take advantage of economies of scale. So as global demand expanded, their costs kept going down, and they became more and more entrenched. And the result is these companies, we know all of them, have huge operations, various huge operations, which are that's become their habit. That's what they know how to make money. So they get very nervous about small companies, and that's why you see BHP, for instance, selling off South 32, all the little things got dumped into a dust can and then sent off. And I think that the reality is that the big deposits usually, I think most of them, the odds are most of them have been found. And where they are existing is in countries which some of these companies have avoided, like the Congo. But they'll just have to go there. That's where the deposits are in countries which haven't been explored. They I think will now go there because that's their business and invest in those countries. The other way they'll try and manage it is perhaps get regions where they can become dominant. When you look at BHP trying to take out Oz, the logic is to consolidate South Australia copper fields into one operation which can be managed, have synergies and be managed. So it's just, they're going to carry on in business, they're going to do it. Their main objective is to survive as companies, and they'll do what is necessary to do it. And market force is amazing, it just solves all the problems in time.
Rick, you perhaps move more down at the smaller level, the junior miners or the mid-caps. Do you think this is, in fact, the era when we start to see more nimble and the smaller companies best able to develop the new opportunities in the critical metals?
I would suggest we've been seeing that for 40 or 50 years. Our host, Bernard Swanepoel, was actually part of that with the reformation of Harmony and everything that spun out of Kahn's mine. His colleague, Mark Bristow, came from nothing to form Randgold, now Barrick. So I see a continuation of a trend in motion that's been in place for literally, I guess, 50 years. There would seem to be a trend in the private sector around the world in outsourcing some of the more difficult, some of the more volatile, but also some of the more lucrative aspects of all of commerce. Drug companies outsourcing to, in effect, juniors, the discovery of molecules which become good drugs and then the acquisition of successful efforts, rather than maintaining their own huge research budgets over time. So we're seeing that in mining. If you look in the copper space now, you see the first quantums of the world, the Antofagastas of the world. So I suspect that I hope you will continue to see a very turgid, very entrepreneurial place where, as Sandeep has pointed out, we look for sources of capital that we never exploited before, particularly end users, where to some degree the successful efforts get consolidated by the companies that are large enough to manage supply chains, the BHPs and the Rios, and where the early risky heavy lifting, the application of intellectual capital, be it geological capital or sociological capital, the ability to operate in places like Congo or Kyrgyzstan, gets outsourced to people like me who are foolish enough to try it. So I suspect that the answer to that is all of the above. And I suspect that that isn't something new. I think it's really something that has marked my entire career. It's taken me a while to recognize it. But I think, the old saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah. Henry, the other question is, will miners have to train for very different skills? If they're not just digging the stuff up, they have to move through the whole value chain. Neil Froneman was saying yesterday, they're investing in all sorts of different parts of the value chain. How do you think the companies are going to establish transparency of their supply chains. This is the thing that more and more the investors are asking in the UK because of ESG reasons, but also I've been surprised since the Russian war at how accurately the LME has been able to track some of these flows of metals. So in the work that you do and in writing your book, will companies need to work on tracking the transparency of their supply chains?
Yeah, so just on the first point, it's interesting in this energy transition that we're seeing the benefits of vertical integration come back in a big way. In terms of car makers making their own batteries, but also miners getting into more processing. And I think that is a more difficult skill set. And what the West, I think, really lacks is the technical know-how, the engineering know-how for a lot of processing of these minerals, which China really dominates, especially rare earths. So that's one thing I think. If miners, move into the processing, that's one thing they have to acquire. The other is just new technologies. If you look at Rio Tinto's lithium project in Argentina, it's going to use direct lithium extraction, DLE. So it's a new technology. So that's another area where miners have to come to grips with new technologies for extraction. And just on transparency, I agree. This is, this is a big consumer demand, like we saw with diamonds before, I guess, with the Kimberley process. I think, we're not necessarily there yet, but people are using blockchain and other sort of experiments. But at the moment, you need to have China on board, right? Without China on board with these initiatives, a lot of this material that's mined gets sent to China for processing. I like to think of China as just like hoovering up all these raw materials from around the world that are then turned into batteries. So I think we need, I know it's not very popular now, but we probably need engagement with China and Chinese companies to bring them on to these transparency initiatives. And I just can't see it working with that piece of the puzzle at the moment.
Yeah. So definitely companies are going to have to seek out or train new skills. That's the conclusion. How do you attract, and I'm going to ask each speaker very briefly, how do you change the image of mining to attract the sorts of young people and the different skills that are going to be needed for the next 10 years? I just want to tell this audience that in South Africa, it's almost a given still that the resource sector is exciting, it's big, and you can make money in it. But in the UK, we have a problem on our Rothschild desk that one of the guys' girlfriend is a Australian environmentalist, and every night he gets home, he gets flack for being on the mining desk at Rothschild.
You must get a new girlfriend.
I did say to him, how does she feel about the bonus? But yes.
Spoken like a banker.
But it's a huge issue outside of resource countries. So just very quickly, we're going to need all sorts of different people in the next 10 years. How do you change the image and get young people excited? So let's start with Sandy.
Yeah, I think the thing is this last few years is going to change the attitude of people to mining, because once you're frozen in the dark, you actually say, these guys are doing something for us. What I see as interesting is actually, as you say, it's an elderly industry, so you're going to get a very sudden age transition happening in it. There are lots of elderly people are going to have to go because they've reached the end of the road, and so there are going to be a lot of opportunities for people to do things in the mining industry. And the mere fact that what's happened in the last 2 years has focused the attention of everyone on these minerals, and I think the outcome can be quite positive for the mining industry. Okay, we have to have better spin doctors, but that's just hiring someone who can tell the story.
Yeah. Rick, your view on how you improve the image of mining to the young?
I think it's a big non-problem. For sure, the guys my age, whether we want to go or not, mortality will take us out. So there will be a real age transition. What's going to happen is that my face, old, fat, bald, white, isn't going to be the face of mining. When I walk through oil and gas companies, oil and gas consultancies, oil and gas engineering firms, as an example, in Houston, I see Nigerians, I see Chinese, I see Indians, I see Venezuelans. When I talk to Mark Bristow about the middle management at Barrick, where he's getting the performance, they're Malian. I mean, I hate to be woke, something I'm very seldom accused of, but I think the face of mining is going to become young. It's going to become, in some substantial measure, female. It's going to be yellow, it's going to be black, it's going to be brown. By the way, that probably means that the industry is going to have a cultural affinity that it hasn't had for the last 100 years through no fault of its own. It is simply going to be that the industry will more correctly reflect the people and the regions that it serves.
Yep.
About 6 years ago, was at a conference in Vancouver, and the two speakers before me, one was Aboriginal, and the other was an industry guy. And the Aboriginal guy was moaning about the lack of opportunities in northern BC available to young Aboriginal people who had to leave and go to the city. And the person right before me, the white guy, was talking about the difficulty recruiting young people to train to go into the mining industry. And it occurred to me that if those two people merely met after their respective speeches for coffee, that the circumstance would work itself out, which is, by the way, precisely what happened. The Brucejack mine in northern BC now is staffed 40% by Aboriginals. And I suspect that the dilemma that you describe with regards to the transition in talent in the mining industry will be precisely more people that broadly reflect all of the constituencies, the consumer constituency, the producer constituency, the ethnic constituencies that we serve.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be spectacular.
Thank you. Yeah, good comments. And Henry, here we have a young guy. So, Henry, how do we get your mates interested, and how do your mates view the mining industry?
Yeah, I agree with Rick that we need to see a complete change. Diversity. You can't have. You look at the three big mining companies. It is disappointing. We should have more diversity at the top, and that will come. I do think connecting yourself to the clean energy transformation is important for young people who want to be part of that. So miners teaming up with automakers, that's exciting. But I think also importantly, don't greenwash, right? That's the worst thing you can possibly do if you try to create the impression you're doing this great thing and it's greenwash. I think people are really now getting serious about not wanting to be greenwashed too, and I think that can turn people off in terms of wanting to work for a company, right? So I think that's incredibly important.
Yes, that's what your book says. So just tying up the discussion, I'm going to put all three panelists on the spot. I want them to give you, the audience, one major threat they see over the next 10 years and one major opportunity for the mining companies as this seismic change throws everybody off course. So let us start. Local is lekker. Let us start with Sandy.
Yeah, well, I see the opportunity as exploration. I think the technology of exploration has advanced tremendously, and there's ability to find things under sands now which you couldn't find, and so on. And I think the incentive to do exploration is great, and I think the expenditure will be rewarded. I think there's a great deal of opportunity, and there are areas which haven't been explored, like Saudi Arabia, for instance. The threat, I see it's inflation, cost of capital. The market's price, the tips price in inflation in the next decade being 2.5% or something, 2.3%. That's delusional. So I think there's going to be a lot more inflation, which means interest rates are going to be much higher. And there's a huge demands on capital, you see. You must remember you have unfunded pension funds in Europe and America. The cost of this transition is going to absorb a lot of money. But there are lots of other things. Just restructuring the infrastructure generally is going to cost things. So there's such calls on things. Interest rates are going to be high, and costs of capital has been high.
And inflation. Thank you, Sandy. We're getting tight on. So Rick, we know you can do sound bites. Threat and opportunity.
I would agree with the opportunity. I think exploration is deeply out of favor. I think exploration in countries that are challenging is out of favor, but I think that's where the discoveries are going to take place. That's certainly where my money is. And I think he did risks too fairly well. I would sum up the greatest risk as government innumeracy. $369 billion spent in a U.S. boondoggle around picking winners, where the U.S. Congressional Budget Office itself says it will have no meaningful impact on global climate. $369 billion, even for a country like the U.S. that thinks it's rich, is a stunning amount of money. So I would say that government innumeracy, and perhaps voter innumeracy, is the biggest risk.
Yeah, thank you. And Henry, pulling you in as the last one.
Yeah, so I think the biggest threat to me is a worsening of the relationship between the West and China, because I think that could really, not only could increase the cost of the transition to clean energy, but it could delay it as well. And I think what we need to do is harness the competition between the US and China, which is slightly happening now, to advance the Western industries. To that point, I think the biggest opportunity is the localization of supply chains. I think this can be a huge opportunity in the US and in Europe. And for Western mining companies, this is a huge opportunity because they can, prove greater traceability and ESG, etc. So, yeah, that's what I see as the two threats, the threat and opportunity.
And you speak with a lot of authority, having studied in China, having worked there for 6 years, and also speaking Mandarin. So thank you. I would just, on a very light note, say I think the biggest challenge is for the next 10 years is for the Indaba. How do you find a successor for Bernard?
I'm going nowhere.
And the opportunity is, I think we've seen more younger people at this Indaba than I've ever seen, and therefore there must be somebody out there who can do even better than Bernard.
But before she gets carried away, I've got so many questions. But I had a request, and I think this person wants to go. So please, can you just look at the bag? That's standard Anglo bag. If you took somebody else's bag accidentally, there's a red molluscan book in there which the person really would like to return. So could you please just have a look if you accidentally took? And we also lost one phone in 2 days. Not bad. Rick, thank you so much for saying nice things about me. My wife is in the audience. After 20 years, it's always good to just hear something nice being said, you know what I mean? So thank you for that. There was a specific question for me, but I want to hand it over to the audience. Bernard, what is your favorite mineral of the future? Clearly it's manganese, as an owner of a manganese business. That puts 17% of the manganese in the world's batteries today, the only one outside China. That's my personal preference. But Rick, you didn't even mention manganese. I worry, Henry, we struggle to get you guys to pay attention to manganese. And Sandy, you should know better. Why aren't you speaking about it? Rick, let's start with you. Manganese, is it on your radar screen at all?
It is. We don't look at manganese as being in particularly short supply. We believe, I shouldn't say we anymore, I'm allegedly retired. I'm perfectly happy to own a tier 1 sand and gravel deposit. I'm less commodity specific than I am attracted to large, decent grade, high return on capital employed projects. Manganese, vanadium, that whole suite of metals are attractive to me.
And Henry, obviously manganese, as in all of these metals, there's an in-between step. There's the beneficiation process. I mean, that's obviously part of the value chain that you understand probably as good as anybody.
Yeah, so that's right. It's really interesting because China only mines around 80% of manganese, but it processes 95%. So that's just a huge dominance in the processing side of manganese. And again, that's a huge challenge for the Western world in terms of trying to diversify, just diversifying away from Chinese processing of manganese. Manganese is a really key battery chemistry, and it's something we are focusing on. We just hired someone to focus on manganese. So yeah, very, very key. Huge opportunity for South Africa as well.
Sandy, do you concur with that?
Yeah, I have to support manganese, of course, but as you produce it, frankly, my preference at the moment is things made out of carbon, oil, gas, coal.
You dinosaur. What did you call him?
But we're going to need a lot of carbon to decarbonize.
That's correct.
I can see the headlines, but our journalists are looking for controversy, and we're not giving that to them. We need a lot of carbon to decarbonize. I want to ask Henry, these mega battery plants that have been announced, are they going to actually be, are all of them going to come into production with enough supply?
Yeah, well, this is the huge issue, right? There's over 300 gigafactories, I think, in the pipeline. And as I said earlier, one's seemingly announced, every other week. You're exactly right. Raw materials are the key bottleneck to this. So you can build these battery factories relatively quickly, but unless you have the raw materials, and as you all know, building a mine is a much longer process. It doesn't come into production on target. So I agree, we're facing quite a difficult situation, which is why battery producers are keen to invest in mining companies. And we just seen actually this week the CATL, the world's biggest battery producer by a long way, investing in China Moly, which has a mine in the DRC, and is probably going to be the biggest cobalt producer this decade, overtaking Glencore. So that's why battery companies are investing in mining companies, because they're building all these plants, but they're going to need a lot of raw materials.
Rick, if we can bring your sort of passion and expertise areas of junior mining companies and even exploration companies back to a South African context. It must be shocking that there are no exploration companies of note in South Africa. It must strike you as impossible to believe that there is no junior mining sector in South Africa, or is that just, are we done? Have we done it and we will never have it again? Just give us your perspective with your expertise.
I like to think, I hope, given how good South Africa was to me, Bernard, in the Consmine days, that there will be a new dawn for South Africa. Foreign capital would love to come into a junior sector in South Africa if the government would permit it. We need to be welcome, and frankly, the industry needs to be welcome in South Africa. We look forward to more indigenous entrepreneurs to lead that effort. But the government needs to allow it. There needs to be reformation with regards to exploration tenor. There needs to be fiscal stability. To be blunt, foreign capital isn't interested in coming into South Africa to address past wrongs. That isn't high on our investment agenda. Our investment agenda is getting paid. And to the extent that South African society believes that mining is one of the ways forward to South Africa, I suspect that you would see a very vibrant junior sector in South Africa. It makes much more sense to lead exploration efforts in Africa from Africa. The idea that those efforts are led from Sydney or Vancouver, many time zones and many cultures away, makes absolutely no sense. But until South Africa decides that South Africa should have a junior industry, those of us who would like to fund it are precluded from doing so.
Sandy, I never thought I would live long enough to hear you excited about exploration. But that's as the concept. You don't really plan to invest in exploration, or do you?
Well, the problem with investing in South Africa in exploration is you usually get offered one company, so you've got one horse in the race, and the chances of losing is quite high. To be exploration, you must have a portfolio of companies, and we can't really create that portfolio so that we don't go there. But if you're sitting in Canada, for instance, you can, and in other parts of the world, you can accumulate a portfolio of interesting exploration things. And it's the old rule, just need one to go up 100 times and you've made your money.
So, sounds easy.
Please, you do agree that you say, Rick?
I said, it sounds easy. Just get one that goes up 100 times. I don't know why I didn't think of that.
Rick, I see you on social media. I mean, you regularly pick the big ones, so, just keep on doing that. So, Henry, for South Africa, battery metals, where should we focus? Well, if we had a national plan, if we had a developmental government that was functional, where should we develop?
Well, I think you mentioned manganese already, right? And vanadium's another one that I know South Africa's big in, and that could be used in energy storage as well. And then I think, exploring opportunities in other minerals. And also, we talked about batteries, but obviously hydrogen fuel cells and the whole hydrogen economy is taking off as well, and platinum obviously can play a role in that. So that's another opportunity for South Africa. I don't think we should discount fuel cells. They could work for trucks and other applications. It's not just one technology for every application. So I think that's also going to be an opportunity as well. And then I think clean energy, I think, is an opportunity for the whole of Africa as well.
Fiona, I'm going to hand back to you to wrap it up.
Excuse me. Thank you all. I would like to say that I think the biggest threat for the next 10 years for mining companies is that there is no clarity from the political point of view on the energy transition. As I said, since the war started, there is now a conflict between energy security, leading to Sandy's view of you can stick with coal and fossil fuels and you need to, versus you are actually in the next 5 years not going to be able to drive a car unless it's an EV car. And for an industry that needs certainty for long-term investment, that is going to be a very, very tough next 10 years to cope with. So thank you all for your views, and I think that everybody on this panel is happy to take other questions from the audience if they needed to.
No time left.
No.
To send them home. Rick has to wake up, Henry has to go to bed, and Sandy...
No, I meant on email.
Yeah. So
yes.
That is the end of the session. Thank you. Fiona, you pulled together an amazing conversation once again.